Syria. The best way to start Syria is to juxtapose it against Egypt. Places like Egypt or Bahrain, when people set it up, they always say the United States needs to choose between strategic interests, national security interests of cooperating with the state against humanitarian interests or democracy interests. What's so interesting about Syria is the interests line up. We have a humanitarian interest, obviously, in stopping the carnage. Roughly, what, 12,000 people, plus or minus, have lost their lives since it began over the last year. And we have strategic interests, particularly given the Iranian connection with the Assad regime. So it's not one of those places where you've got to choose. We're realists and idealists, if you will, or loggerheads. In this case, there's much more of a parallelism than is the case in other things. It's not a question, though, I would say, where I disagree with you, Jeffrey. It's not that we're doing nothing. The United States is doing some things. There's sanctions and the rest. The question is, what are the options? There's military intervention. We can talk about that. There's arming the opposition, which is happening largely through the Arabs. The United States is playing a slight role there, covertly. And there's a version of the status quo, what I would call status quo plus, or intervening without arms. And there's a lot more we could be doing short of the others. For example, we should be threatening those who support the regime with war crimes indictments. We should be upping the sanctions. The sanctions against Syria should be at least as draconian as the sanctions against Iran. All civil aviation between Syria and Europe and anywhere else, and the Arab world, where we can get Arab countries to agree with us, ought to be cut off. Arab countries who are unhappy with Syria, and many of them are, the Sunni countries, they ought to go to Russia, and they ought to be pulling out ambassadors and introducing economic penalties against the Russians. We ought to be sitting 24/7 with the Syrian opposition, so they make statements and they put together a serious opposition that essentially reassures the Alawites of Syria, the minority that run the country, that they will not suffer the fate of the minority Sunnis in Iraq once Saddam was gone. They have to know that they have a real and safe place in the future of Syria. So I actually think there's a lot more we could do. And then, we can discuss here, I don't want to take too much time, the pros and cons of the two major escalatory options, which is all-out arming of the opposition or physical military intervention, if you will, a Libya plus scenario. I think it has major shortfalls and major problems, but we can put it on the table.
But Jane, you're close to the administration, and I want you to answer this question. Richard is right. There's an alignment here that you usually don't find. There's obviously a humanitarian interest. But Syria, we're talking about a regime that's Iran's foremost ally and only Arab ally. You're talking about Syria, it's a primary sponsor of terrorism. This is not an issue of, well, Mubarak is our friend, so really should we be abandoning him. This is an issue where Syria, where the departure of this regime could have only beneficial effects on our national security, if obviously an al-Qaeda government doesn't come into play, which we can work on. So why does this administration seem so passive on this question?
Because the options are absolutely terrible. And there's total war fatigue in America. There's an election going on. I thought I would point that out. And there is no attack by air strategy that will, of itself, cause regime change. So that means we or some group of somebodies has to go in by land. Think land war, another land war, which nobody wants. That's the problem in Iran, too. I agree, and I know our government agrees that Bashar should go, but I think the only real option is the Yemen option, which we can't seem to get to happen yet, but which is he goes, his family gets sanctuary someplace, hopefully in Russia, which should want to get him out, but doesn't. And then a government is structured including Alawites. I completely agree with Richard. It's face-saving for them, and most of them, or some of them, are not butchers trying to, destroy the rest of the population. But if that government isn't structured, there will be all-out civil war. These are people who absolutely hate each other. It's totally tribal, and there are al-Qaeda folks in the mix. So I think arming the opposition when we don't know who it is really a crazy strategy, and is going to end up with arms being used against interests that we seriously have.
Nick, is it that dire? Is what she proposes that dire? I mean, are we facing no good options and no possible means of support short of?
I said the Yemen option is the good option, but
you said but it's not.
Well, going in military option and arming the opposition are not.
Well, let me reframe it. If you were making policy right now in the Obama administration, what would your policy be?
Well, I would just like to say, I think that Jane's right in the sense that we've got to have a sense of restraint here. Psychologically, throughout most of the last 30 or 40 years, we Americans in both Republican and Democratic administrations have tended to think that when we act, we can resolve all problems. We cannot resolve this problem through a U.S. military intervention. This is not Libya for all sorts of reasons. So I think that's an important point to make. On the other hand, I think Richard makes a very important, powerful point. We've got nothing to lose by focusing in on Assad.
But Jane says we do have something to lose.
I'm just trying to agree with Richard now.
Okay.
Typical diplomat.
Yeah.
Typical diplomat. They're both friends of mine. We've all worked together. But I think
I'll agree with you, Jane, in the
I think
future.
there's a bridge here. And that is, what does the president have to lose if he sanctions Assad to the extent that we've sanctioned Iran, as Richard suggested, and if we make his departure a clear objective of our policy? This gets to diplomacy. And I think what's happening now, Secretary Clinton is meeting Foreign Minister Lavrov of Russia today. The U.S. is obviously trying to convince the Russians that if they want to have influence in Syria in the future, they shouldn't be the last country standing as Assad departs stage right or left in the next couple of months. Assad's going to lose power. The only question is when. Can Russia be part of that solution? As Jane says,
Or lead it.
can they lead it? And can there be a Yemen-type solution? We engineered the departure of Ali Abdullah Saleh from Yemen. He was promised a safe, peaceful life.
Right.
No trial for war crimes, no execution. Assad should take that deal because he'll be leaving power. Russia's the key. And this is a final point here, Jeff. We've got a lot of people saying that Russia's a problem. It is a problem. Governor Romney has said, and I'll bet he wants to take this back, that Russia is the greatest adversary of the United States in the world. Not true. Russia's many things. It's a very difficult country for us to deal with, and it opposes us on a host of issues. But it is a partner on counterterrorism. It's been very helpful in the resupply of our troops in Afghanistan, and Putin may hold the key on two big Middle East issues, Iran and Syria. If we're going to get an Iran deal, and that's a very difficult proposition to imagine, Russia's probably going to help write that deal. And the same is true with Syria. So despite our disaffection from Vladimir Putin and Sergei Lavrov, we've got to work with them. And I think that's what the president's trying to do, and I think that's a sensible policy.